today we're going to be talking about why it's important to maintain control over your pelvic floor. Very often after a vaginal delivery, or if you've had some type of surgery on your pelvic floor, you might have lost that connection between the brain and the pelvic floor. And maybe you've heard people talking about Kegels and about the importance of doing pelvic floor exercises. You might also have heard people saying that Kegels don't work and there's no point in doing them, and pelvic floor muscle training doesn't work. It's all one and the same. But today we're going to talk about why it is important to maintain control over your pelvic floor. It's important to maintain control over your pelvic floor because if you lose control of your pelvic floor, it can atrophy. And if your pelvic floor atrophies, that's where the muscles start to weaken and break down, then your pelvic floor starts to sit lower. And then you can start to experience the symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunctions. And those dysfunctions can be stress incontinence, you can have the symptoms of an overactive bladder with urge incontinence, or a mixed incontinence where you have symptoms of multiple different types of incontinence. Also, there can be problems with sexual function where you can have a less sensation in sex, and also then the contractions when you have an orgasm. It is your muscles, your pelvic floor muscles that contract, and that's what creates those beautiful sensations. So there also you can have a loss of strength in those contractions, and you can find that your orgasms are weaker. And another symptom is flatulence or anal incontinence, where you can actually leak fecal matter, so you can poop yourself, and that's a really, really unpleasant symptom. So it's very important to maintain control over the pelvic floor. And if we want to go a step further, when you start typically to notice symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction, it is a little leaking here or there. It is, they tend to be fairly mild symptoms, loss of sensation, things that you maybe don't take very seriously, but it's really important to take note and to actually do something. And I'm going to show you why. So if we look at the pelvis, we can see that there are many muscles that line the whole bottom of the pelvis, and these muscles run front, back, side to side. They cover the whole floor of the pelvis. So it's like a little elastic bottom on your pelvic bowl, if you imagine that the pelvis is like a little bowl. And all of your pelvic organs sit in here. Your bladder, your uterus, your rectum, and your intestines, they all sit on top of this pelvic bowl. So this is a floor. That's why they call it the pelvic floor, and it's a floor with an elastic bottom. Now, when your pelvic floor becomes atrophied or lax and weak, it starts to drop, so it becomes lower. And your pelvic organs are resting on this pelvic floor. Now, think of it like this. If you build a house, let's imagine that the foundation, the floor on our house is the pelvic floor. And let's imagine that the organs are all little bits of furniture that are sitting there. So obviously if the pelvic floor goes down, the organs are going to move down as well. But they're not going to just move down right away, because the organs are not only depending on your pelvic floor. You also have a network of connective tissue within your pelvic floor. And there's numerous different, think of them like suspension cables that come from the front and the back and the sides, and they wrap around the neck of the uterus, so around the cervix. And this provides stability, not just for your pelvic floor, but functional stability for your body as you move. So if all of these little organs are like pieces of furniture that have these little suspension cables that are made from connective tissue, then you can imagine that as your floor starts to drop, the suspension cables have to take the weight of the furniture to hold them up. Now, they're not actually there to hold your organs up. They do provide stability, they do distribute load when you're moving, and they do hold your organs a little, but they're not actually supposed to support the full weight of your organs. So to demonstrate what happens when the pelvic floor drops, we're going to use my little friend, Stretch Armstrong. So here we have my little friend, Stretch Armstrong, and we have some weights. So you can see I've already attached one to his belly, poor chap. But we're going to pretend that Stretch Armstrong is the ligaments that are attaching around the pelvic organs. And let's pretend that our 3 kilo weight they're the pelvic organs. And we're going to use my knee as the pelvic floor. So if we take the ligaments, bear with me while I grab onto this little man. If we take the ligaments, so they're all sitting like this, the pelvic floor is nice and high, everything's very stable. But as the pelvic floor lowers, what you see is that these ligaments start to stretch and the organs start to pull downwards. And if we take the floor far enough away, then these ligaments are going to get really, really long. Now, if we work on the pelvic floor and we start to shorten it again, what happens is the ligaments can recoil a little. And if you think about your muscles, they are very elastic in the properties. So they stretch and recoil very quickly. But when you think about connective tissue, you have to imagine a type of tissue that until recently, actually, it wasn't believed had stretch properties, but your connective tissue does have stretch properties. So these tissues will stretch slowly, but they also recoil very slowly. And this is why when you suffer a pelvic organ prolapse, it doesn't happen overnight. You start to see symptoms of leaking. You start to see maybe you're having problems with bowel movements. You might have to put your fingers into your vagina to splint to help with bowel movements. So things take their time to fall into the different parts of the vagina. It can also happen not just because of the weakening of these connective structures, but a pelvic organ prolapse is it's like a hernia within your pelvic region. So we can take a look at another little pelvis, and that's this little happy pelvis. And we've put in here a little ball, and just imagine that this is your stomach is coming down here, so the contents of your intestines are all around here. And then this is all of your pelvic organs. And every time you move and you do things, you create pressure, even just breathing. When you inhale, there's a downward pressure, and when you exhale, there's an uplifting motion. So if you allow the pelvic floor to weaken and become lax, then it goes lower. Then all of those ligaments get stretched as the organs start to hang. And if you leave it there, then you add this pressure. And what happens is the organs start to protrude. The pressure will find always the weakest point. So it'll look for the path of least resistance. And then you will end up with these little kind of hernias basically in the pelvic area. So it's really, really critical that if you have any symptoms, don't ignore them. Don't just let it pass you by. Don't think, oh, I don't mind if I leak a little. It's not actually a normal thing to leak. If you're leaking urine, that is your body's way of telling you something isn't quite right. So you should really take the time to do something about it. So if you can lift your pelvic floor back up again, then it gives those ligaments a chance to recoil a little. So it gives them a chance to come back up, and it helps to bring the organs back up into place. Now, I'm not saying that doing pelvic floor exercises is going to heal a grade 3 or grade 4 pelvic organ prolapse. It's actually quite unlikely. You may need surgical intervention if the prolapse is very far progressed. But pelvic floor exercises will help to lift the floor that supports the organs. And this will help to prevent a worsening of the prolapse if you do have one. It can also help to improve things. And then if you add things like hypopressive exercises, so low pressure fitness, where you do stomach vacuums in order to tap into the reflex that is between the breath, between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. When you can get that reflex going and get your breathing right, then things can start to improve quite naturally. And many people have reported going from a grade 2 prolapse to grade 1, or even all the way back to grade 0. So don't give up. Take the time to reconnect with your pelvic floor, maintain control of your pelvic floor, and you will be much better for it.